Sometimes a story starts with a sound. For Esther Hale, it was the crack of a whip. Not a real one, not yet. It was the crack of a man's voice, sharp and ugly, slicing through the thick, dusty air of a town called Redemption Creek. A town whose name had long since become a bitter joke. It was 1884. 2 years since the fever had taken her husband Henry. 2 years since it had crept back into her little cabin and stolen her daughter Clara. 2 years of silence, a quiet so heavy it felt like being buried alive. Esther's world had shrunk to the size of her small homestead, a patch of stubborn dirt at the edge of town. She woke, she worked, she slept. She kept the grief at bay with the rhythm of chores, a wall of meaningless tasks to keep from remembering the meaningless end of her family. But on this day, she'd run out of kerosene. A simple thing. A trip to town she'd been putting off for a week. And that's when she heard the voice. Arthur Vance, the town blacksmith, a man whose arms were as thick as his skull, a man who saw himself as the law in a lawless land. He was standing in the middle of a crowd, a tight knot of angry, sweating faces, and in the center of that circle, held by two grimy men, was a girl. She couldn't have been more than 15. Her hair was black as a raven's wing, her face sharp with the proud lines of the Cheyenne. But right now that pride was a fragile mask over pure animal terror. Her eyes, wide and dark, darted through the crowd, looking for a hand to pull her out of the nightmare. She found nothing but hate. "Stole a whole sack of flour!" A woman shrieked, her voice like a rusty nail. "Right from my wagon!" The girl, whose name Esther would later learn was Mesa, said nothing. Her silence wasn't guilt. It was a shield. A thin, cracking shield against the tidal wave of their fury. Vance let the accusation hang in the air, savoring it. He puffed out his chest, playing his part for the audience. "We have laws against thievery in this town," he boomed, "and we make examples of thieves. 10 lashes. Let it be a lesson to her kind." A gasp rippled through the crowd. Part horror, part sick excitement. 10 lashes. The words hit Esther like a physical blow. She'd seen a man take 5 once. A drunk who'd broken a window. He was a big man, a rail worker, and he'd screamed like a child from the second lash on. He couldn't walk right for a month. For this girl, this slip of a thing, it wasn't a punishment, it was a death sentence. A slow, agonizing one. Esther felt the world tilt. The heat, the dust, the angry faces. It all blurred. And in that blur, she saw another face. Clara's. Her little girl, scared of the dark, scared of thunderstorms. And something inside Esther, something she thought had been buried with her daughter, broke open. It was rage, cold and pure and white-hot. She didn't decide to move. Her body decided for her. Her feet, clumsy in her worn-out boots, carried her forward, pushing through the stunned crowd until she was standing right in front of him. Right in the center of the storm, the town went dead silent. The reclusive widow, the ghost from the edge of town. What in God's name was she doing? "Mr. Vance," she said. Her voice was rusty, like an old hinge, but it didn't tremble. Vance scowled, his authority challenged. "Mistress Hale, this ain't your concern." "The girl," Esther said, her eyes locked on his. "She's just a child." Vance let out a laugh that had no humor in it. "She's a thief, and the law is the law." "This isn't justice," Esther said, her voice growing stronger. "It's cruelty." She risked a glance at the girl. Mesa's eyes were fixed on her now, the terror replaced by a tiny flickering spark of hope. And that spark was the most painful thing Esther had ever seen, because she knew it was about to be extinguished. There was no arguing with these people. There was no reasoning with this hate. There was only one currency they understood. Pain. The idea was insane. It came from a place beyond thought, from that raw, broken part of her that had nothing left to lose. She had already lost everything that mattered. What was a little pain? What was a little blood? "Then let me," Esther said. The words fell into the silence, and for a moment nobody seemed to understand. Vance stared at her, his mouth hanging open. "What did you say?" Esther took a deep breath. "You heard me. You want a debt paid. You want 10 lashes. Let me take them for her." The shock that rolled through the crowd was a physical thing, A wave of pure disbelief. Arthur Vance looked at her as if she'd just confessed to being a witch. This wasn't part of his show. This wasn't a scared Cheyenne girl he could brutalize for sport. This was the widow of Henry Hale, a man everyone in this town had respected. He saw the hesitation in the faces of his posse. He saw his power slipping, and a cruel, twisted idea began to form in his mind. Breaking a Cheyenne girl was one thing, a public spectacle. But breaking the spirit of a white woman? Humiliating the widow of a good man in front of the entire town? That was a different kind of power. That was a statement. A wicked grin spread across his face. Very well, Mistress Hale. A debt is a debt. He gestured to the hitching post in the center of the square. Tie her up. The men hesitated, looking at each other, then at Esther. But the fear of Vance was stronger than their decency. They moved forward. Esther didn't flinch. She walked to the post, her back straight. She untied her bonnet and let it fall to the dust. As they tied her wrists to the rough wood, she turned her head and met Mesa's gaze. The girl's face was a mask of horror. Esther gave a tiny, almost imperceptible shake of her head. A silent command. Be strong. Then she closed her eyes and waited. She thought of Clara's hand in hers. The smell of baking bread. Henry's quiet smile. The first lash felt like a bolt of lightning. It ripped the air from her lungs and set her entire back on fire. She heard the crowd gasp, a single horrified sound. She bit down on her lip, hard, tasting the copper tang of her own blood. She would not scream. She would not give them the satisfaction. The second lash came, then the third. Each one a fresh wave of agony, a new language of pain. Her world shrank to the splintered wood under her cheek and the fire on her skin. She counted. It was all she could do. 1, 2, 3. Each number a small victory, a rebellion. At 10 it stopped. For a long moment she just hung there, limp, every muscle screaming in protest. The world slowly swam back into focus. They untied her. She stumbled, but she didn't fall. Her legs, shaking, somehow held. She bent down, her back a shredded mess of blood and torn fabric, and picked up her bonnet. She could feel every eye in Redemption Creek on her. She didn't look at any of them. Not at Vance, not at the shocked faces of the townsfolk, not even at Mesa. She just turned and began the long, painful walk home. Every step was an eternity. Every jolt sent fresh fire across her back. She thought it was over, an act of madness, paid for in blood. She had bought the girl's life with her own pain. A fair trade. She thought that was the end of it. Of course, she was wrong. It was only the beginning. The next day was a blur of pain. Esther had spent the night drifting in and out of a feverish sleep, her back a landscape of pure agony. She'd cleaned the wounds with salt water, a task that made her nearly pass out, and applied a poultice of yarrow from her garden. But even the simple act of breathing was a trial. She was outside feeding her chickens with slow, stiff movements when she saw them. 5 riders on the ridge that marked the edge of her property. Her blood went cold. They weren't townsfolk. Their silhouettes against the morning sun were unmistakable. Long hair, lean frames, the way they sat their horses with an easy grace that spoke of a life spent in the saddle. Cheyenne, fear, primal and sharp, stabbed through the fog of her pain. They've come for me. The thought was immediate, certain. Maybe they thought she was part of the town's cruelty. Maybe they thought her act was some kind of trick, a white woman's game they didn't understand. Or maybe they were just here to finish what the town started. She backed toward her cabin, her heart hammering against her ribs. The only weapon she had was a small hatchet by the fireplace. It would be useless. She was trapped. But they didn't charge. They rode down from the ridge with a slow, deliberate purpose that was somehow more terrifying than an all-out attack. They stopped at her fence line, a clear gesture of respect, and dismounted. On foot, they approached her cabin. Esther stood frozen in her doorway, clutching the frame for support, watching them come. They were all tall men, their faces like stone, impossible to read. The one in the lead was older, with a long white scar that cut through his left eyebrow. He looked like a man who had seen 100 battles and won them all. She braced for the worst, for an accusation, for violence. Instead, the 5 warriors stopped about 20 feet from her porch. And then, as one, They did something that shattered her reality. They knelt. Right there in the dusty yard, these 5 fearsome men went down on one knee, bowing their heads to her. The leader looked up, his dark eyes meeting hers. There was no anger in them, no threat. There was something else, something she couldn't begin to comprehend, a deep, unsettling gravity. "We are the brothers of Mesa," he said. His English was clear, though clipped with an accent. He gestured to himself. "I am Vulcan." He pointed to the others in turn. "Medavato, Hungahaka, Woka, Chaitan." Esther could only stare, her mind reeling. Mesa's brothers. Why were they here? Why were they kneeling? "Our sister," Vulcan continued, his voice low and steady, "told us what you did. You took the whip that was meant for her. You took her shame. You took her pain. Our people, we do not have a word for such an act. From one of yours." He paused, his gaze sweeping over her, taking in her pale face, the stiff way she held herself. He saw the pain she was trying to hide. "It is a debt that can never be repaid," he said, "but it must be honored. You live alone. You have no husband, no sons to protect your home." He stood up and his brothers rose with him, a single fluid motion. "From this day until the last of our days," Vulcan declared, his voice ringing in the still morning air, "we are your protectors. Your fight will be our fight. Your enemies will be our enemies. We pledge our lives to you, woman who took the whip." The words hung there, unbelievable. A pledge, a life debt, to her. Esther's head spun. This was not what she wanted. She hadn't done it for a reward, for honor. She had done it because she saw her daughter's face in a stranger's eyes. It was an impulse, a moment of madness. And now it had brought this terrifying, immense complication. "No," she whispered, shaking her head. "You don't have to. I don't want... I want to be left alone." Vulcan's expression didn't change. It was as if he hadn't even heard her protest. "It is not a choice," he said. "It is our honor. We have sworn it." He looked toward the creek that bordered her property. "We will make our camp in the trees. We will not disturb you, but we will be here. You are not alone anymore." Without another word, they turned, walked back to their horses, mounted, and rode toward the creek. Esther watched them go, a storm of emotions warring inside her. Fear, confusion, and something else, a strange and unwelcome flicker of relief. She had built a fortress of solitude around her grief, brick by silent brick. And in one afternoon, she hadn't just breached the walls. She had accidentally hired 5 of the most dangerous guards on the entire frontier. And she had a sinking feeling her quiet, lonely life was over for good. But she didn't realize the pledge wasn't just about honor. It was about something much older, something tied to the land itself, the very land her cabin was built on. The brothers set up their camp in a grove of cottonwood trees by the creek, just as Vulcan had said. They were far enough away that Esther had her privacy, but close enough that their presence was a constant, unnerving fact of her new life. At night, she could see the faint flicker of their campfire, a single orange eye in the darkness. Her first instinct was to ignore them, to pretend they weren't there, to go on with her life as if 5 Cheyenne warriors hadn't just sworn a blood oath to her, but they made that impossible. On the 3rd morning, she opened her door to find a freshly dressed rabbit on her porch, skinned, cleaned, ready for the pot. She hesitated. Her own snares had been empty for days. Pride warred with hunger. Hunger won. She took the rabbit inside, feeling a hot flush of shame and something akin to gratitude. The next day, it was 2 plump prairie hens. The day after that, she woke to the rhythmic thwack of an axe. Peeking out her window, she saw the one they called Medavato, the biggest of the brothers, a man who seemed to be carved from rock and leather. He was systematically dismantling a huge deadfall oak at the edge of her property, splitting the logs with an efficiency that was mesmerizing. By noon, a stack of firewood, taller than she was, stood neatly by her cabin. More than she could have chopped herself in a month. He did it without a word, and then he was gone, melting back toward the creek. A strange, silent conversation began, a language of deeds. They left game. she started to feel a strange obligation. One evening, after stewing the rabbit, she found herself with far more than one person could eat. On a wild impulse, her heart thumping in her chest, she carried the heavy iron pot and left it on a flat rock halfway between her cabin and their camp. She scurried back inside, her cheeks burning, feeling like a fool. She didn't dare watch to see if they would take it. The next morning, the pot was sitting on the same rock, empty and scrubbed clean. Slowly, day by day, the fear began to fade, replaced by a reluctant curiosity. She started to learn their rhythms, their personalities from a distance. Vulcan was the unquestioned leader, the one who made the decisions. He moved with a quiet authority that needed no words. Medavata was the silent giant, the provider of wood and muscle. He moved with the slow, inexorable force of a glacier. Hungahaka was younger, leaner, with a restless energy that seemed to burn in his eyes. He was the hunter, the one she saw practicing with his bow for hours, his movements a blur of deadly grace. The other two, Woka and Shaitan, were the watchers. They were often gone for hours, slipping away into the plains like ghosts, only to return and report to Vulcan in the low, flowing sounds of their own language. They were her eyes and ears, and she didn't even know it. And then, one afternoon, another visitor came. Mesa. The girl approached the cabin slowly, hesitantly, clutching a small deerskin bundle. Esther's breath caught. She opened the door and stepped onto the porch. Mesa stopped a few feet away, her eyes on the ground. "I brought you something," she whispered, holding out the bundle. "For your back." Esther took it. Inside was a pot of a dark, fragrant salve and a collection of dried herbs. Willow bark for the pain, comfrey for the healing. "Thank you," Esther said, her voice thick. Mesa finally looked up, her eyes shining with tears. "No one," she said, "has ever done that. For me, for any of my people." "You're just a child," Esther said softly. The words came out before she could stop them. "You reminded me of my daughter." It was the first time she had spoken of Clara to another living soul in 2 years. A crack appeared in the dam of her grief, and in that moment, a bond was forged between the broken mother and the rescued girl. Mesa started visiting every few days. She would help in the garden, her presence a quiet comfort. Esther taught her English words: shovel, water, sun. Mesa, in turn, taught Esther the Cheyenne names for the plants, the birds, the way the wind sounded before a storm. Through Mesa, the brothers became less like terrifying specters and more like men. She learned their story. Their father had been a great chief, killed by soldiers. Their mother had died of sickness just last winter. They were a family adrift, clinging to the old ways, to their honor, in a world that was trying to erase them. And Esther learned something else, something that made her blood run cold. The pledge they made wasn't just a spontaneous act of gratitude. "There is a story," Mesa told her one afternoon, her voice low as they weeded the bean patch. "A prophecy from a long time ago. It says that when our people are scattered and our hope is almost gone, a woman with a spirit of fire and a heart of sorrow will take a great pain upon herself for one of us. It is said she will bear the stripes meant for another, and in doing so, will bind the fate of the last sons of our line to her own." Esther stared at her, the garden trowel slipping from her hand. "A prophecy." "My brothers," Mesa said, "when they heard what you did, they believe you are this woman, the woman who took the whip. They believe protecting you is not just a matter of honor. It is their destiny." Suddenly, the weight of their presence felt 1,000 times heavier. This wasn't just a debt. They saw her as a figure from their oldest legends. She, Esther Hale, a simple grieving woman, was now a key part of their sacred story. But the prophecy had another part, a darker part. It also said that the woman would be a beacon, that she would draw the deepest hatred from the world of men to her doorstep, and that a great battle would be fought on her land to decide the fate of their family. "What kind of battle?" Esther asked, her voice a whisper. Mesa just looked at her, her dark eyes filled with a sad wisdom far beyond her years. "The kind that leaves only one side standing. A sanctuary built on a prophecy couldn't stay secret for long. Not in a place like Redemption Creek. The town had been buzzing ever since the day of the whipping. Esther's bizarre act of defiance was the juiciest piece of gossip they'd had in years. But when the writers came to her homestead, the gossip curdled into something dark and ugly. It started with whispers. Did you hear? The widow Hale has taken up with savages. 5 of them, living right there on her land. She's bewitched them, I tell you. Or worse, she's one of them now. Her act of compassion was twisted into an act of treachery. Her sacrifice was proof of her madness. Arthur Vance, his ego still bruised from being so publicly undermined, was the one stirring the pot. He held court in the saloon, his voice booming, painting Esther as a traitor to her race, a dangerous woman who had invited a nest of vipers into their midst. They're a threat, he'd roar, slamming his fist on the bar. A threat to our women, our children, and she's protecting them. What does that make her? His fear-mongering found fertile soil. These were people who already saw the Cheyenne as less than human, a problem to be solved with a rope or a rifle. Esther felt the shift immediately. On her next trip into town for supplies, the silence that fell when she entered the mercantile was no longer pitying. It was cold, hostile. Mr. Callahan, the storekeeper, served her without meeting her eyes, his hands trembling slightly as he bagged her flour. People crossed the street to avoid her. She was an outcast. But there was something strange about Mr. Callahan. As he handed her the change, his fingers brushed against hers and she felt a small folded piece of paper pressed into her palm. She slipped it into her pocket without looking, her heart starting to beat a little faster. Back at the homestead, she unfolded it. The handwriting was shaky. Vance is buying up rifles, telling men he's forming a militia. He's not just talk, be careful. The note was unsigned, but she knew. Callahan, the man who had sold her husband his burial suit. He was afraid, but he was trying to warn her. She wasn't entirely alone. The very next day, Vulcan appeared at her door, his face grim. Men on the ridge, he said, his voice low. Watching the cabin. They have rifles. The militia. It had already begun. The tension on the homestead became a living thing. The peace they had started to build was poisoned by the constant threat. Hungahaka's hand never left the hilt of his knife. Medavado's silence deepened, his eyes always scanning the horizon. Woka and Chaitan became true ghosts, spending their days shadowing the town's spies, silent hunters tracking other hunters. One evening, Chaitan returned to their camp with something. He laid it on a blanket for Vulcan to see. It was a wooden stake, crudely sharpened, with a surveyor's mark carved into it. They are not just watching, Vulcan said to Esther later that night, his voice tight with a controlled fury. They are measuring your land. Esther felt a chill that had nothing to do with the night air. Why? This land, Vulcan said, looking not at her, but out at the dark creek bed, was where the sacred winter camp of our grandfather stood. Our father, the chief, is buried on that hill. He pointed to a small rise just beyond her property line. The stones that mark his grave look like simple field stones to your people. But we know. It all clicked into place. Henry had bought this land cheap. No one else wanted it. It was considered poor soil, too close to the creek. But maybe that wasn't the real reason. Vance doesn't just want you gone, Vulcan said. He wants this land. He knows its history. To him, erasing our father's grave and building on this sacred ground, it is the final victory. It is a way to kill our spirit forever. This wasn't just about a whipped girl anymore. It wasn't just about racism or fear. It was about greed, about history, about the desecration of a sacred place. And Esther's cabin, her small plot of stubborn dirt, was standing right in the way. The note from Callahan, the spies, the surveyor's stake, they were all pieces of a much deadlier puzzle. Arthur Vance wasn't just a bully. He was a man with a plan to take her land, wipe out the last remnants of the Cheyenne family, and erase their history from the earth. And he was willing to kill anyone who stood in his way. The prophecy Mesa had spoken of, it was no longer a story. It was a storm gathering on the horizon, and it was heading straight for them. The storm broke on a Sunday. The church bells of Redemption Creek had just finished their hollow, clanging call to worship when Esther saw the dust cloud on the horizon. It was big, too big for a single rider. Vulcan was at her side in an instant, his eyes narrowed. They are coming. The brothers materialized from the trees, their movements silent and efficient. This was the moment they had been preparing for. They weren't gathering for a fight, they were preparing for a war. A posse of a dozen men, with Arthur Vance at their head on his big black horse, rode onto her property. They didn't stop at the fence. They rode right through it, splintering the posts, their horses' hooves churning her garden into a muddy ruin. The beans, the squash, the herbs she and Mesa had so carefully tended, all trampled into the dirt. Esther rushed out onto her porch, Mesa cowering behind her. The five brothers fanned out in a line between the cabin and the riders. They held their bows and war lances. Their faces were painted, not with the bright colors of ceremony, but with the grim, dark patterns of battle. They were no longer just men. They were warriors, embodying generations of ancestors who had fought and died for this land. The yard became a tinderbox, the silence crackling with imminent violence. "Esther, hail!" Vance bellowed, his face red and swollen with rage. He was holding a new rifle, a Winchester, and he waved it toward the brothers. "We've come to put an end to this filth. You will send these savages packing, and then you will come with us to account for your treason." Esther trembled, but not with fear. It was a fury so pure and cold it felt like ice in her veins. She looked at the faces in the posse, men she'd known her whole life. Thomas Callahan was there, his face pale, his eyes avoiding hers. Mr. Donovan, who her Henry had helped build a barn for. They were cowards, hiding behind Vance's bluster. She looked back at the five men standing ready to die for her. She knew where she stood. "This is my land, Arthur Vance," she called out, her voice ringing with a clarity that shocked even herself. "And these men are my guests. They are under my protection." A few of the men laughed. "Your protection?" Vance sneered. "You're a mad woman. Stand aside." He raised his rifle, a clear threat. In response, Hungahaka drew an arrow and knocked it to his bowstring in a single fluid motion. The tip of the arrow was pointed directly at Vance's throat. The world seemed to hold its breath. A single gunshot, a single released arrow, and this yard would become a slaughterhouse. And that's when Esther did something no one could have predicted. She walked down the steps of her porch. She walked past the line of her painted protectors. She walked right up to Vance's horse, so close she could see the sweat on his upper lip, the crazed look in his eyes. "You want to talk about treason, Arthur?" she said, her voice low but carrying across the tense yard. "Let's talk about the Fort Laramie Treaty, the one that guaranteed this land to the Cheyenne before men like you decided a signature on paper meant less than the gold in the hills." Vance's eyes widened in shock. How did she know that? "You want to talk about filth?" Esther continued, her voice rising. "Let's talk about the winter of '78. The winter a Cheyenne hunting party was found dead, shot in the back, their winter provisions stolen. A crime that was blamed on Pawnee rivals." She took a step closer, staring him down. "But the Pawnee don't use the custom-loaded brass cartridges you favor, do they, Arthur? The kind you were casting over at your smithy all that fall." A murmur went through the posse. They were looking at Vance now, not at Esther. "You think I don't know who you are?" Esther's voice was a blade now. "My Henry knew. He knew what you did. He knew you sold poison flower to the reservation the year the fever hit them so bad. He was going to tell the territorial marshal. But then he got a fever of his own, didn't he? A sudden, violent fever, right after sharing a drink with you at the saloon." The air crackled. The story of Henry's death had been a tragedy. Now it was being reframed as a murder. Vance's face went from red to a pasty white. That's a lie. You're a crazy lying witch." "Am I?" Esther turned her gaze on the posse. "Ask him. Ask him where he got the money for that new forge. It wasn't from shoeing horses. It was from blood. The blood of men he murdered for their supplies, and the blood of a friend who was about to expose him for the monster he is." She took a deep breath, her righteous fury reaching its peak. "These five men," she declared, gesturing to the brothers, who were watching her with stunned awe, "have shown me more honor and decency than this entire town. They live by a code you could never understand, a code that says a debt must be paid, and you, Arthur Vance, have a debt that is long, long overdue." Then from the line of warriors Vulcan spoke. His voice was not loud, but it cut through the silence like a judgment. My father was the leader of that hunting party, he said, his eyes locked on Vance. You did not just steal our food, you murdered our chief. The final piece clicked into place. This wasn't random. This was a reckoning. Vance's past had finally caught up to him, right here in this trampled garden. The posse was in disarray. The men were lowering their rifles, their faces a mixture of confusion, disgust, and dawning horror. They had come here to fight savages, led by a man they thought was a town hero. Now they were realizing they were the minions of a murderer and a thief. Mr. Donovan was the first to turn his horse, then another, then another. Vance saw his support collapsing. Panic took over. He let out a strangled roar of fury, aimed his Winchester not at the brothers, but at Esther. He never fired. An arrow, faster than a thought, flew from Hungahaka's bow. It didn't hit Vance. It hit the wooden stock of his rifle, splitting the wood and sending the gun flying from his hands. At the same time, Metavato let out a war cry that seemed to shake the very foundations of the earth and charged. He wasn't aiming for Vance. He was aiming for his horse. The giant warrior slammed his shoulder into the animal's flank. The horse screamed, reared, and threw a terrified Arthur Vance into the mud of the ruined garden. He landed hard, the wind knocked out of him. He looked up to see 5 painted warriors and 1 furious widow standing over him. His reign of terror was over. His posse was gone. A shame-faced retreat galloping back to a town that would never see him as a leader again. They left him there, unarmed and defeated, his face covered in the same dirt he had so desperately craved. In the quiet aftermath, Vulcan walked over to Esther. His face, usually a mask of stone, was filled with a profound emotion. The prophecy was true, he said, his voice soft with reverence, but it was not about us protecting you. He looked from the defeated man on the ground to Esther's face, which was blazing with a strength she never knew she possessed. It was about you, leading us to our justice. He knelt, not as a warrior pledging a vow, but as a man honoring a chief. His brothers followed, kneeling in the trampled mud. Mesa ran to Esther and hugged her, burying her face in her dress, tears of relief streaming down her cheeks. Esther looked at the family she had forged in fire and blood. She looked at the home she had defended. The grief for Henry and Clara was still there, a quiet room in her heart. But now the rest of the house was filled with a fierce, burning light. She had taken 10 lashes for a stranger. In return, she hadn't just gotten a family. She had uncovered a murder, exposed a villain, and reclaimed the honor of a people. She had found her own redemption, not in a town's name, but in an act of impossible courage. Life after the confrontation settled into a new kind of peace. Arthur Vance was taken away by the territorial marshal a week later, after Mr. Callahan and several other men from the posse found the courage to tell the truth. They told of his confession by silence, of the evidence in Esther's words, and of the murder in his eyes. He was never seen in Redemption Creek again. The town itself seemed to hold its breath, watching the homestead on the edge of its consciousness. But the fear was gone, replaced by a grudging, bewildered respect. They left Esther and her strange family alone. The invisible line between the cabin and the camp disappeared completely. The brothers moved from the creek into the barn, reinforcing it against the coming winter, their presence a constant comforting shield. They ate their meals together at Esther's long wooden table, a mix of Cheyenne and English words filling the silence that had once haunted the small cabin. Mesa became the daughter of the house, her laughter echoing where Clara's once had. Esther taught her to read from an old Bible, and Mesa taught Esther the stories of the stars. Vulcan, the solemn leader, became her confidant. They would sit on the porch in the evenings, speaking of the future, of how 2 different worlds could become one. Metavato, the silent giant, became the heart of the homestead, his strength and tireless work making the land flourish. He replanted the garden, built stronger fences, and watched over them all with a quiet devotion that was more powerful than any words. Hungahaka's fire didn't go out, but it was banked into a protective warmth. He taught Esther how to shoot a bow, her aim surprisingly steady, and he was the one whose quick jokes could make the whole table erupt in laughter. Woka and Chaitan remained the watchers, the guardians, their skills ensuring that no threat would ever creep up on them again. One cool autumn evening, as they all sat around a fire in the yard, Vulcan brought out a long, carved wooden pipe. He filled it with tobacco and sacred herbs, and after lighting it, passed it to Esther. In our way, he said, when a family is made, a new name is given. We no longer call you woman who took the whip. Your courage has a name. He looked at her, his dark eyes reflecting the firelight. We call you Nehyo Esse. It means the woman who stands strong. Esther took the pipe, her hands trembling slightly. She looked at the faces around the fire. Her family, Vulcan, Medavato, Hungahaka, Woka, Chaitan, Mesa. A family born not of blood, but of choice, of sacrifice, and of a fierce, unbending love. The hollow ache in her chest, the one that had been her constant companion for 2 long years, was gone. It hadn't been replaced, it had been healed. She had lost a family to sickness and silence, and in the face of hatred, she had built a new one. Years passed. The homestead thrived. Other Cheyenne families, hearing the story of the woman who stands strong and her 5 warrior brothers, came seeking refuge and found a welcome. The small patch of land grew into a community, a place called Strong Stand Creek, where 2 cultures learned to live as one. Redemption Creek, on the other hand, slowly withered. Its soul had been corrupted by Vance's hate, and after he was gone, there was nothing left but the shame. The businesses closed, the people moved on, until it was little more than a ghost town, a testament to a failed way of life. Esther lived to be a very old woman, her hair as white as the winter snow. She was a leader, a mother, a grandmother to a generation of children who knew nothing of the hatred that had almost destroyed them. She became a legend, a story told to children around the fire. The story of a quiet woman who, with one impossible act of courage, rewrote the fate of a family, redeemed a piece of stolen land, and proved that the strongest walls are not built of stone or wood, but of love and honor. She had faced down the worst of humanity and had shown them what true strength looked like. And in the end, it wasn't the whip, the guns, or the anger that won. It was the quiet, unbreakable spirit of a woman who had nothing left to lose, and in doing so, gained everything. If you enjoyed this story and you believe that one act of courage can change the world, do me a favor and hit that subscribe button. And let me know in the comments below, what do you think is the true meaning of redemption? Thanks for watching.